created a world-changing, not world-ending, a world-changing, world-improving omnivirus. And we have taken that virus and embedded it in the vaccine of this Stearns flu.
Overwhelming and unexplainable increase in all-cause deaths among 18 to 49-year-olds. Along with that, there's also been an increase in certain medical diagnoses, such as miscarriages and Bell's palsy.
And now everybody's begging for the vaccine.
No. Demanding it with all the entitlement of a first world country.
Yes. And now we have exactly what we want. Hundreds of millions of Americans lining up, offering us their arms, and letting us give them our creation. We intend to stop human reproduction for 3 generations. The busy, endless global assembly line of babies will grind to a halt.
World population over the last several hundred years. And at first glance, this is a bit scary.
And it spawned a new genre of fear that lasted for generations. The fear of overpopulation.
Welcome back to the channel. I'm your host here, Ariel, and in today's episode I wanted to discuss what is Amazon trying to tell us in the series Utopia. Now, I don't know if you guys have watched Utopia. I'm going to give you a little clip, little glimpse of what Utopia is. Check it out.
Jessica Hyde had a daddy who was a genius scientist. Now, Jessica and her daddy were held by an evil villain named Mr. Rabbit. He made Daddy Hyde create horrible viruses. Until one day, a hero named Artemis broke out Jessica and her daddy. Mr. Rabbit sends his henchmen, the Harvest, after them. The Harvest kidnapped Daddy, so now Jessica Hyde has to save him. But that's just the mythology. Dystopia appeared in 2014, and if you're smart, if you're really, really smart, you can study it and decipher all the real-life epidemics it predicted. Here, Ebola, MERS, Heartland virus, just to name a few. See, that's why we need Utopia, because who knows what horrible things are coming next. I mean, why do we keep feeling like it's the end of the fucking world?
So let's break down what Amazon was trying to tell us in their series Utopia, which was released in 2020. Now, Utopia follows a group of young adults who met online who were fans of this comic book called Utopia. They met up in person for the first time at a Comic-Con type convention, and they were working together to try and purchase the very exclusive comic book Utopia. While they were there, they were able to sneak a little peek of the comic book, but they were not able to purchase it. So after they left, they got together and they were hanging out. Shortly after that, there was a mass shooting that occurred at the Comic-Con, and it ended up killing everyone who viewed the comic book. Just so happened, during the Comic-Con, there was a young woman there as well by the name of Jessica Hyde, who wanted to also get access to the comic book as well. But guess what? Jessica Hyde was the main character in the comic book. So she was trying to get access to the comic book because it was like her history and she needed to know more. She wanted to find out where her dad was. So in her pursuit of trying to get the comic book, she ran into the group of people who end up surviving the mass shooting, who also seen the comic book as well. And she asked them, "Where's the comic book? Do y'all know who have it? What's the deal?" They stated, "No, we don't know who has it. Who are you?" She explained to them that she was Jessica Hyde and that she was the character in the comic book and that the comic book was based off her life. They didn't believe her until she was able to convince them otherwise. She explained to them that it's very dangerous people out looking for this comic book, and if they wanted to stay alive, they needed to follow her. Fast forward to episode 3. In episode 3, we are introduced to the world that is occurring at the same time that this group of people are trying to find Utopia. In the world outside of their small little world, there was a deadly virus that was affecting the youth of America. And it shows a scene of the parents begging the CDC to release their children from a quarantine FEMA camp type situation. They were begging the CDC to allow them to go in to be with their children, but they were being denied access. All while this is occurring, they fast forward to a scene where Christie Labs, which is ran by an individual with the last name Christie, forgot his first name. And at Christie Labs, the FDA was there trying to figure out whether or not the lab-grown meat that was being fed to the children had anything to do with the fact that a lot of them had this said virus. While they were there, they got cleared, basically saying like, hey, this lab meat has nothing to do with this virus and it's just a coincidence. They then let us know that not only do Christie Labs produce the lab-grown meat that's being fed to the children, but they also produce the vaccine that is said to cure the virus that the children have. They also show us another key player in this show, and it is a scientist. And the scientist is the one who actually developed the vaccine with Christie Labs. And they basically showed how he was a low-level scientist. Nobody really paid him much attention. The only thing that he was known for was developing this vaccine. So when he realized that the virus that he was testing the vaccine on became something that was affecting the children, he went to the CEO of Christie Labs, asking him if he could do further testing on the vaccine to make sure that the children are safe when they take it. And the owner of Christie Labs stated, no, that's not necessary. It's safe. Everything is fine. So fast forward to the scientists going to the quarantine camp, begging the guards to allow him in, the National Guard to allow him in so that he can do further testing, since the CEO of Christie Labs was not allowing him to do so. They denied him access. They said, no, you're not able to go in. And so he ended up working with the parents to try and get in, to try to get access to this quarantine camp. He ended up meeting a man who was the father, quote unquote, to one of the children that was affected by the virus. But before we go any further, let me stop there to kind of explain the concepts that I picked up on in the first 3 episodes. The first concept that I picked up on is that random men was employed to go to the Comic-Con convention and murder anyone who's seen this comic Utopia. Who sent them? Why would they do this? What's in the comic book Utopia? The second concept that I noticed is that there was a large deep state ran organization called Christie Labs that not only produced lab meat but also produced the vaccine. And then not only did they produce the lab meat, but the lab meat was being fed to the children who just so happened to have a virus, and they just so happened to create the vaccine to cure the virus. Another concept that was very interesting in these first 3 episodes is that the CDC had authorization to quarantine children without their parents' consent. And they also had authorization to keep their parents out of this said quarantine camp for however long it took before they were able to cure the said virus. Okay, it's a lot going on here. So episode 4 starts off with us following one of the men who were a part of the mass shooting to kill everyone who viewed Utopia. He was speaking with the CEO of, you guessed it, Christie Labs, and the CEO told him that his job is to make sure that everyone who viewed the comic book was dead, that he brought Jessica Hyde, who remember is the main character of the comic book, back to him, and that he actually brought the comic book to him as well. Now, we fast forward and they show us a meeting that was being had by individuals who seemed to know exactly what was going on in the world at that time. They talked about Jessica Hyde. They talked about this scientist who created the vaccine. And then they also talked about the individuals who viewed the comic book as well. Now, in their meeting, they were brainstorming on how to get control over the quote unquote threats, which were Jessica Hyde, the scientist, and the other individuals who viewed the comic book. They realized that, okay, we know who has the full copy of Utopia, which is a young boy who was also introduced in episode 1 and 2, who was a part of this friend group, who he was actually able to get a hold of the full Utopia comic book, but he was not with the quote unquote crew. He was out on his own, running and hiding from the people who were programmed to kill them for viewing Utopia. So this particular group who was having this meeting, they already knew that, and they knew about him, and they were trying to figure out a way to get him under their control, in their custody. So they brainstormed, and they were talking about creating a false flag event, their words, not mine. And in this false flag event, they wanted to go to a park, shoot up a whole bunch of children and their parents, and then blame the shooting on the kid who had the copy of Utopia. Now, one of the members of this think tank, I like to call it, just so happened to be the wife of the CEO of Christie Labs. And she opposed this. And she stated, I don't think we should do this. This is inhumane. Now, mind you, she was all for, killing the children with the virus. She was all for feeding them the lab-grown meat. But when you go to a park and shoot and kill the kids point blank just to find the comic book, that is where she drew the line. And so instead of them going to the park to conduct this false flag event, they end up killing her and her family, and they blame the kid that they were looking for ultimately. So then flash forward and we go back to the scientists. The scientists finally was able to get into the quarantine camp. And inside the quarantine camp, he went in with the father that I spoke of earlier, with the daughter who was affected by the virus. So him and the father went in and they were speaking with the daughter, and he gave the daughter the vaccine. Shortly after, the daughter ended up dying, but they didn't tell the scientists this. They end up switching the body of the daughter who died with a girl who looked just like her. And they showed us that the father of the daughter who was affected by the virus was actually in cahoots working with, you guessed it, the CEO of Christie Labs and the think tank and everybody that's involved, right? So the daughter ended up dying, but then they switched her body out with her twin. And it showed everyone like, hey, the vaccine's safe. You don't have to worry about it. The vaccine won't kill you, even though it definitely killed the man's quote unquote daughter. They just switched her out. Now, episode 4 was jam-packed with a lot of very, very telling concepts. The first one that I wanted to discuss a little bit further is false flags. Now, false flags is something that we see all the time in our society. We see where the media, they have a quote unquote villain, and that villain usually is an individual who is a shooter in a mass shooting situation. The shooter usually is military. The shooter usually gets killed before they actually go to trial, go to prison, or anything like that. And if the shooter is not considered military, then the shooter is usually a part of an organization that the deep state deems as an enemy, like a patriotic white male or someone who believes in guns and protecting themselves, things of that nature. We also know that false flags always have something to do with agendas, whether that's gun control, whether that's promoting hate, black men kills white people kills black people, etc. They also showed us that not only are false flags planned, but they are also used to blame individuals. They are also used to actually kill people in real life. So they're planned, but real people are the casualties to some of these false flag events, according to the show. To me, that is giving very much so blood sacrifice, giving very much so witchcraft, that type of thing. But I digress. Another thing that they introduced in episode 4, mind you, episode 4 was very dense. Another thing that they introduced is the concept of body doubling, which a lot of people would call a conspiracy theory. But in the show, they showed how they utilized twins to manipulate the public by thinking that one of them was alive even though one of them died. Later in the show, which I am very much so jumping the gun, it explains the concept of breeding children, basically showing how the deep state, or whoever you want to call it, literally breeds children so that they can be used in different ways, whether that is in false flag events, trained assassins, which we seen in episode 1, testing viruses, testing vaccines, etc. They also showed how the children are being bred and being placed under control using methods like MK Ultra and those type of things, according to the show. This isn't me. I'm not a conspiracy theory. This is what Amazon is telling us in this show, Utopia. So fast forward to episode 5 and 6. Episode 5 and 6 begins to follow the girl that we mentioned previously who switched bodies with her twin who actually died after taking the vaccine. We begin to follow her. And she is in front of the crowd of parents who are desperate to find and get back connected with their children. She's telling them like, hey, the vaccine worked. And look at me, I'm proving that. And that it's safe and that your children should get this vaccine, which is playing on the hearts of the desperate parents. Then the scene shows the girl and her quote-unquote father getting in the car. And her father explaining to her like, hey, you're doing too much. And she basically expresses that she's just doing what her purpose is. And she expresses how much she believes in the vision that the Christie Lab CEO, aka member of the deep state, have. And that vision is to, you guessed it, control the population by any means necessary. And so her father was like, yeah, that is the vision. Let's stick to it. Long story short, the father end up bucking the system. He ends up talking against her. He ends up being a little wonky, untrustworthy. And so what did the CEO of Christie Labs do? He ended up making some phone calls, and the quote-unquote father was then killed. Now, the news said that the father committed suicide, but that wasn't true. He was actually killed. So then there was a scene that flashed back to that think tank that I spoke of earlier. And it was the individuals in the think tank minus the mother who was ended up killed because she had opposed the previous plan to do the mass shooting at the park. Minus her. But back to the think tank, they decided, hey, we need to basically create a whole life story for this man so that when the public begins to look into his story, it makes sense and they won't question who the quote-unquote father really is. Another concept that episode 5 and 6 showed us is that the propaganda actually worked. That the young girl being the face of the vaccine and pulling on the heartstrings of the desperate parents worked, so much so that they began to demand the vaccine. And guess what? The FDA and the CDC complied and they released the said vaccine. Now, at the time, remember, the scientists did not want that to occur. The scientists, though they did kind of make him believe like, oh, it is effective and you don't have to worry about it, he still had his doubts, and he wanted to go on the news and the media and say like, hey, before you guys allow your children to get this vaccine, let's, do a little bit more testing, make sure that it's extremely safe. Even though this one girl survived, let's just make sure that it's extremely safe. But guess what? His wife, the scientist's wife, who wasn't introduced previously, the scientist's wife was actually a handler put in place to keep him in line. So when he started talking about, oh, I want to go to the news, I want to say this, that, and the third about how the vaccine may not be as effective as it's supposed to be, she kept him in line to make sure like, hey babe, relax, chill, let's just let it play out. He continued to buck the system. He continued to try and speak out, and his wife, quote unquote handler, basically revealed herself and said, hey, I was put in this place to make sure that you stay in line, that you allow them to release this vaccine, and that everybody that needs to be killed if necessary is killed, because they are not important to the grand scheme of things. The only people that is important is the people that's associated with Christie Labs and the deep state. This is basically what his wife was saying. But just to give you a little recap of what 5 and 6 was really about, they talked about child breeding, they talked about MK Ultra, they talked about how suicide was actually murder, and how they create false stories to cover up the murders that they commit. They talked about how they put people in place as handlers to people who they believe is a threat to their agenda. And so you would think somebody is your wife, but in actuality, she's a handler put in place to make sure that you don't fall out of line. Wow, that was a lot, right? Yeah. So this is what Amazon is trying to tell us on Utopia. So let's recap. Utopia informed us that there was a deep state ran organization that produced lab-grown meat. They also produced vaccines that kill people. The organization targeted the youth. The CEO and founder of the organization also had a child breeding farm, which they manipulated and used MK Ultra to control the children to go out into the world to do their quote-unquote purpose, which included but not limited to testing vaccines and viruses, killing people who got in the way of their agenda, conducting false flag events, creating false narratives to manipulate the public, and so much more. They also have handlers to control their assets, and they had the government agencies in their back pocket. Oh yeah, let's not forget they are also obsessed with population control.
Population. Now the world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%.
So Amazon thought that it was a good time in the year of 2020, at the height of the pandemic, whatever you want to call it, to recreate this series and introduce it to the American public. Yeah. Watch the show, y'all. Watch the show. Tell me what you think in the comment section down below. Hope you like this video. Subscribe to the channel.